A key question in epistemology is the relationship between mind and reality. Our common sense view is that we know things as they actually are in the world. This position, held by traditional philosophy, is called epistemological realism and holds that we are in direct contact with the outside world through the senses. For realists, barns themselves are a certain color, flowers emit an odor, and air has temperature. However, we sometimes find that our senses are not always in agreement. A man with color blindness may perceive a barn as green when everyone else sees it as red. Flowers that smell sweet to some may seem stinky to others. And the same air may feel warm to one man and cool to another. Due to these disparities, many philosophers in the modern period became skeptical of realism and proposed an alternative, namely, we only know things as they appear to us. This position is called epistemological idealism and asserts that our senses are not in direct contact with the outside world. According to idealists, the mind does not encounter objective reality, but only a subjective idea. Idealism accounts for discrepancies in sensation, but it also suffers from a serious problem. For if all we know are ideas, how can we be sure anything real exists beyond them? This question would trouble thinkers throughout the modern period. The 16th century was an age of upheaval in Western intellectual life. During this time, the scholastic method of education that arose during the Middle Ages, which was exemplified by such thinkers as St. Thomas Aquinas, was replaced with a more individualistic approach to learning. As a result, academics abandoned the ancient teachings of Aristotle, authoritatively taught in universities, and developed their own novel approaches for studying the world. The first pillar of the old order to fall was Aristotelian science. Copernicus challenged Aristotle's geocentric model of the universe by postulating that the Earth orbited the Sun, and Galileo offered evidence for this heliocentric theory. With these contributions, a new science developed that rejected appeals to the traditional authorities for explanation, but instead devised a method to form hypotheses from data gathered through direct observation and experimentation. This science not only offered new explanations, but changed the way people looked at the world. In contrast to the Aristotelian view of a purposeful world populated with substances and regulated by final causes, new thinkers proposed a mathematical and mechanistic view that reduced the world to atoms in motion. The consequence of this development was a disconnect between the ordinary and scientific conceptions of reality that would have important implications for epistemology. The second pillar to fall was Aristotelian philosophy. Having refuted Aristotle's science, the new thinkers hastened to dismiss his philosophy as well, in keeping with their principles of distrusting authority and emphasizing individual inquiry. Their rejection was not unwarranted, given that the productive Aristotelianism of the Middle Ages had fallen into decay during the Renaissance, and subsequently occupied itself with pointless disputes. In its place, these thinkers thought to devise a method that would settle the quibbling of the decadent scholastics and produce a consensus among philosophers. René Descartes was at the forefront of this new intellectual movement. Descartes wanted to clear up the confusion around philosophy. He formulated a method which entailed discarding any beliefs which he could doubt. After this, he hoped to be left with one indubitable belief, as a foundation on which he could rebuild all knowledge with certitude. Descartes started the process of universal methodic doubt by testing his most basic principles to see if he could be mistaken about them. He begins by considering the reliability of his senses. Most of us believe that our senses are usually reliable and only infrequently deceive us when we are observing small or distant objects. But he notes that we sometimes think we are awake when we are actually asleep and dreaming. We convince ourselves that we are awake when our perceptions are clear, but dreams can also be quite vivid and realistic, which means we really do not have a reliable way of distinguishing between dreams and the real world. Considering this, we could be dreaming our whole lives, in which case our belief in the existence of physical objects would be mistaken. Even our belief that we have a body might be only an illusion. But even if our senses are faulty, is not our intellectual knowledge still accurate? After all, 2 plus 3 equals 5, and a square has 4 sides, regardless of whether we are awake or asleep. The problem is that there could be an evil demon who deceives us whenever we perform a mental operation. This demon might cause us to think that a principle is true when it is in fact false. Hence, we cannot even be sure that our most basic judgments are trustworthy. However, Descartes claims that there is still one thing we cannot doubt. For the act of doubting itself constitutes a thought, and thinking only exists if there is something existent which thinks. Accordingly, since there is thinking, he concludes he must exist as the source of the thinking. Descartes has demonstrated his own existence as a spiritual thinking subject, but has not yet shown that his mind is in touch with the outside world or a physical body. To do this, he must prove that there is a good God who does not deceive him, which will guarantee his reason and senses render an accurate perception of the world. For this purpose, he formulates an ontological argument based on his idea of God. He first posits he has a clear and distinct idea of God as an infinite substance. Second, he proposes this idea could not have come from himself, since he is a finite being. Therefore, it had to come from God, who must exist in reality as the idea's source. Descartes shows that much of the common sense knowledge we take for granted cannot be justified from a philosophical perspective. In fact, his method can be taken even farther to call into question the accuracy of our introspective perception as well. For we sometimes mistake certain sensations for others, or imagine ourselves to be experiencing sensations when there really are none. Some thinkers have even cast doubt on Descartes' conclusion that a mind must exist to do the thinking. For it could be the case that thoughts exist without an accompanying self. However, while Descartes eliminates many false beliefs from our knowledge by breaking it down to its most basic building blocks, he is not effective at building it back up into a functional edifice. This is because his ontological argument suffers from several significant issues which prevent him from proving God's existence and thereby escaping from the prison of his mind. First, he commits the fallacy of begging the question. By claiming that God must exist, because he has a clear and distinct idea of God. The problem is that by making this assertion, he assumes the point he wishes to prove. For his idea could not be clear and distinct unless God already existed to make it so. If he was not already convinced that God exists, then he could not rule out the possibility of deception by the demon. In other words, the argument comes down to God exists because I have an idea of God. That must be true because God exists. Circular reasoning. Second, he commits the fallacy of equivocation by switching between two different meanings of the term existence. In the beginning of the proof, he is referring to the subjective idea of God, which has mental existence. But at the end, he moves to the objective being of God, which would have real existence. The problem is that his inference involves an illicit transition between two different meanings of existence, mental and real, which signify different modes of being. In other words, just because something exists in the mind does not mean it must also exist in reality. Third, he is incorrect that we have an idea of God as an infinite being. To the contrary, our idea of God is properly that of a being which is not finite. And if we do not have an infinite idea of God, then there is no need for an infinite source for it. Now, he attempts to address this objection that our idea of God is negative by claiming that our knowledge of the infinite precedes that of the finite and must therefore be positive. The problem with his response is that a finite mind is not capable of containing infinite being. He also tries to address this objection by making a distinction between grasping an infinite idea completely and understanding it only partially, acknowledging that the former is impossible for a finite mind, but maintaining that the latter is possible. But how could a finite mind know anything of the infinite divine essence in itself? There is simply too great a difference in degree between the two modes of being for there to be a link by which the mind could come to know the divine essence directly. As Aquinas writes, it is impossible for any created intellect to see the essence of God by its own natural power. For knowledge is regulated according as the thing known is in the knower, but the thing is in the knower according to the mode of the knower. Direct knowledge of God's essence as infinite exceeds man's natural intellectual capacity. We know by faith that we will encounter God directly in the beatific vision, but this insight can be gained only from revealed theology and cannot be legitimately employed in purely philosophical argumentation. Therefore, Descartes has failed to convincingly prove God's existence, which means that he cannot know whether he is being deceived and remains trapped in his own mind. After Descartes, his new idealist philosophy split into two distinct schools of thought. These post-Cartesian schools became known as Rationalism and Empiricism. The main issue dividing them was the dispute over where human knowledge was derived from. The rationalists remained most faithful to the original Cartesian approach. They held that humans have some a priori knowledge, which is present in our minds even before we experience anything with our senses. According to rationalists, Such knowledge includes the principles of logic and mathematics, and for some thinkers, also truths about God, metaphysics, and ethics. Because the rationalists followed Descartes in attributing this knowledge to the mind, their skull is troubled by the same problem as he was. For if knowledge originates inside the mind, there is no way to get outside it. The empiricists took the opposite approach. They held that humans only have a posteriori, or empirical knowledge, which is not innate, but must be acquired from experience. According to empiricists, all our knowledge comes from the senses. At first glance, it may seem that the empiricists avoid Descartes' problem by suggesting that knowledge originates not in the mind, but in experience. However, since these thinkers remain within the fundamental framework of Cartesian idealism, sense perception would not turn out to be the key that would unlock their minds. In fact, their exclusive reliance on it would eventually lead to even greater skepticism. Like Descartes, the empiricist John Locke wanted to attain certainty. However, he also had the humility to accept that our minds have a limit to how much they can know about the nature of things. Accordingly, he contented himself with probing the extent and limitations of knowledge. The building blocks of Locke's epistemology are ideas, the immediate objects of perception, thought, or understanding. These ideas include all the various contents of our minds. Sense data, such as colors, sounds, tastes, smells, and textures. Concepts such as justice, and internal psychological states, such as thinking or being angry. He holds that the common thread among these ideas is that they can all be traced back to something in our experience. For Locke, the mind begins its existence empty, like a blank roll of film in a camera. But once we start to experience things, our minds passively fill with simple ideas that impinge upon the senses, much like a film records images when exposed to light coming through the lens of the camera. In addition, we acquire simple ideas when we reflect on our experience of mental operations, similar to a photographer who recalls a scene or event by looking at the pictures he has printed after the film was developed. According to Locke, the mind also actively puts several simple ideas together to form unified composites called complex ideas. For example, we might combine the ideas of redness, sweetness, and crispness to make the idea of apple. Lastly, the mind draws out the similarities found among several things to form abstract ideas like appleness. It is important to emphasize that for Locke, the mind's reliance on experience does not imply it is in contact with reality. While he holds that ideas do not originate in the mind, but are caused by qualities which inhere in things outside it, he also claims that such ideas do not perfectly portray the qualities of the things from which they are derived. His position challenges the common opinion, direct realism, which asserts that our ideas are exact copies of real qualities. To explain what he means, he introduces a distinction between primary and secondary qualities. primary qualities refer to those properties which reside in the thing itself. These qualities include extension, shape, and motion, which we know through more than one sense. For example, we can experience the roundness of apples by both sight and touch. Primary qualities are the objective properties of things which accurately describe how they exist in the real world. By contrast, secondary qualities refer to the capability of a thing's primary qualities to stimulate our senses in a certain way. These qualities include colors, sounds, and smells, which we know by only one sense. For example, we can experience the redness of apples by sight alone, not touch. Secondary qualities are entirely subjective and exist only in the mind. From this distinction, Locke argues that the mind is in immediate contact only with its ideas. At the same time, he also contends that our ideas of primary qualities indirectly put us in contact with the attributes of objects which exist outside the mind. In this way, Locke attempts to solve the Cartesian problem by claiming that even though we only know the appearances of things directly, we can still reach their underlying reality. His position is called representative realism, but it is actually another form of idealism that cannot secure itself against skepticism. Locke demonstrates that our sense data does not faithfully capture the qualities of real things. At the same time, he persists in maintaining that we can infer the existence of such objects from experience. However, his idealist starting point prohibits him from establishing that our ideas have such a relationship with reality. This is because he cannot claim all he is aware of are his subjective sensations, and also assert he knows objective beings existing beyond his experience. Locke begins to run into epistemological difficulties with his distinction between primary and secondary qualities. For the primary qualities need to have an existence of their own apart from the secondary qualities, if they are to serve as a connection between ideas in the mind and the attributes of things in themselves. The problem is that the primary qualities cannot be separated in this way, since they cannot be conceived in isolation from the secondary qualities. Locke believed that the extension of a thing is a primary quality, since it can be objectively measured in precise mathematical units, and does not change based on the subjective perspectives of different people, unlike the secondary quality of color. But how do we measure the extension of the thing? By holding it against a ruler or tape measure and comparing the colored area occupied by the object with the colored lines on the measuring device. A similar issue occurs if we try to measure its size by texture. If the object was colorless or without texture, we could not see it or touch it to measure its size. The primary qualities never come to us on their own, but must be drawn out from the secondary qualities. We cannot know a primary quality unless we have previously perceived a secondary quality by which we can measure it. And since the primary qualities are contained in the secondary qualities, the former are equally subjective as the latter. Furthermore, Locke's understanding of ideas is ambiguous. For he is not clear whether ideas refer to the action of thinking or to the objects of thought. If it is the former, ideas are exclusively mental operations that have no relation to any other things. But if it is the latter, an even deeper divide emerges between the mind and reality. For Locke holds that knowing involves the mind first forming an idea of a thing, and then knowing that idea. To him, the idea is not the means or process by which we know another thing, like it is in the realism of Aquinas. Instead, it alone is the end or purpose of knowledge. At no point does the mind directly know the thing in itself. It only encounters the idea. This is why Locke's epistemology is a form of idealism. For Locke, the mind is like a man shut in a windowless room, and ideas like pictures which appear on a television screen. The man only knows the pictures on the screen, but from them he reasons to the existence of objects outside the room, which have attributes that can be confirmed through more than one of his senses. For example, by seeing an image on the screen and simultaneously hearing a sound coming from the speakers. The problem is that the man has no way to know whether the things he sees and hears correspond to anything existing beyond the room. Maybe the programming is a news broadcast that actually does represent events occurring in the outside world. But it might well be an animated movie that has no relation to anything happening in reality, and is in fact not even made up of recorded footage, but computer-generated imagery. Since the man only has access to the pictures, there is nothing else to which he could compare them to judge if they are fact or fiction. To know if the ideas in our minds reflect reality would require us to have some direct knowledge of that realm, which contradicts idealism. Another empiricist, George Berkeley, confirmed Lockean representative realism is untenable. Berkeley countered Locke by advancing an argument against primary qualities. He noted that primary and secondary qualities cannot be divided because they always accompany one another and are sensed in the same way. If one quality is mind-dependent, the other will be as well. Since secondary qualities are found in the mind alone, the same must be true for primary qualities. Moreover, he observed that primary qualities do not indicate the existence of things outside the mind. This is because the fact that an attribute can be confirmed through multiple ways inside the mind does not mean that it must also exist outside it. One idea added to another idea equals two ideas, not something of an entirely different order like reality. For one cannot give what one does not already have. We can know an object's extension by looking at the space filled by its color and feeling around the area occupied by its texture. But we cannot claim the extension is objective, for it cannot be split apart from the subjective sensation we have of it. Finally, Berkeley rebuts Locke's argument that ideas represent real objects by pointing out if all we know are ideas, then we can only make associations among them. We can never go beyond the sphere of ideas to determine whether they are connected to anything else. With this, Berkeley concludes that Locke cannot support his belief in a real world existing beyond the mind. Yet another empiricist, David Hume, would take this skepticism even further. Berkeley rejected Locke's stance that there are material things, or substances, outside the mind, which possess primary qualities such as size and shape in reality. However, he still retained an attitude that the mind itself exists as an immaterial substance, which possesses properties, its ideas. The problem is that by positing an unsensed mental substance, Berkeley has violated the most basic premise of the empiricist position, which holds that all our knowledge must come from experience. Hume exposed this inconsistency by noting that we have no perception of a mind or self. Rather, in reflecting on the contents of our consciousness, we find only a series of ideas. We cannot identify a self among the various sensations, imaginations, and emotions that populate our experience. Hume's approach has devastating consequences. For if he is right, then Descartes fails to prove his own existence, since his argument begs the question by assuming the existence of a self he has no evidence for. And the whole project of epistemological idealism seems to lose its starting point and end in extreme skepticism. By the time of the 18th century, both the rationalist and empiricist schools of idealism had spent their vitality just like scholastic philosophy had by the 16th century. Rationalism in the Cartesian tradition had constructed elaborate metaphysical theories about God, the world, and man, which superficially appeared quite impressive. But under the surface, these facades of dogmatic conjecture tottered on unstable epistemological foundations. At the same time, empiricism in the Lockean tradition had collapsed due to its own internal instability. This school had initially seemed constructive, but Berkeley and Hume revealed that its epistemological assumptions inevitably terminate in an unescapable skepticism. Hence, as earlier happened with Descartes, a thinker arose whose bold ideas would chart a new course for subsequent philosophy. Immanuel Kant started in the rationalist tradition, but abandoned it after encountering Hume's writings. However, Kant could not accept the skeptical results of empiricist epistemology, for he remained convinced that we know universal and necessary principles on which we can establish mathematics and science. He also maintained that a real world exists outside the mind as the cause of experience. Consequently, Kant wanted to fashion a basis for such knowledge that combined the logical approach of rationalism and the experiential approach of the empiricists. Kant proposed our minds have an innate a priori structure which comes before experience and provides it with an intelligible pattern. The framework of this structure consists of two forms of sense perception: organizing principles that enable us to place things as being left, right, up, down, back, and forth in a three-dimensional space, and also put them before or after other things in the succession of time. The structure is completed by 12 categories of understanding, concepts that enable us to make judgments about the nature of the things we experience. These categories include such notions as self-evident logical truths, causal relations, and substance. The categories are Kant's key to overcoming skepticism. Hume denied causality and substance because he could not find them in experience. But he did not consider they might be supplied by the mind itself. Kant agreed causality and substance are not sensible qualities that come from experience. However, he maintained that they are the structural principles which make experience possible. For example, we can remove all the empirical properties from an object, but the category by which we recognize it as a substance will remain. And we can know the self when we take the various perceptions we experience through the form of time and unite them under the category of substance. These categories give us an intelligible conception of the world and allow us to speak about it intelligently with other people. And because the categories regulate all aspects of human experience, they must be necessary and universal within it, giving Kant a foundation for mathematical and scientific laws that govern the universe as we perceive it. The cornerstone of Kant's epistemology is his Copernican revolution. Recall that Copernicus overturned the established geocentric cosmology by proposing a heliocentric approach, which shifted the center of focus from the Earth to the Sun. Similarly, Kant reversed the relationship between knowledge and objects. Previous idealist philosophers began with the premise that our knowledge conforms to objects. They held that the mind passively records information coming from the outside world. The problem with this position is that we cannot get outside our minds to see if there really is a resemblance between our ideas and the realities they supposedly stand for. Kant suggests that we try starting from the opposite premise. He asks us to suppose that instead of our knowledge conforming to objects, objects conform to our knowledge. By this, he means that the mind actively processes the steady stream of information it receives from the senses, molding the data into individual cohesive units. In other words, the mind imposes its own structure on the amorphous data of experience to produce what we perceive as discrete objects. To illustrate Kant's view, we consider the analogy of a television. Sense data is akin to the signals received by a satellite dish. If the television were attached directly to the dish, the signals would register as unintelligible static. This is the way our experience would be for us if our minds did not organize the incoming sense data before we became aware of it. But when the television is properly installed, the signals must first pass through a receiver, which puts the data into a format which will appear as intelligible images on the screen. The receiver stands for the mind, the images are the objects, and the screen is experience. The point of the analogy is that the mind must actively synthesize the sensations into an experience that is understandable to us. Otherwise, we have nothing but incomprehensible static. Even this analogy is somewhat inadequate, for static possesses sufficient regularity that we can know enough of what it is to engage in meaningful conversation about it. But raw sense data would lack any order, making it literally unknowable. This observation brings us to the dualism at the heart of Kantian epistemology. For much like Descartes and Locke, Kant distinguishes between the ideas in our minds and a reality which supposedly underlies them. On one hand, we have experience. This internal world is structured by the forms and categories of our minds and is comparable to the images on the screen of a properly connected television. He calls these things as they appear to us the phenomena. On the other hand, we also have that which is beyond experience. This external world is unstructured by the mind and can be compared to the static we would see on the television screen if the signals did not pass through the receiver. He calls these things as they are in themselves the noumena. We never come into immediate contact with the noumena, but we can indirectly deduce their existence as the cause of the phenomena, much as there must be a signal present to produce an image on the television. In this way, Kant tries to preserve a reality transcending experience. Kant delivered idealism from the most radical skepticism by showing that our experience is not random and arbitrary, but structured by set forms and categories. The problem is that by distinguishing between the phenomena and the noumena, Kant cuts the internal order of experience off from the external world. This means that, like the other modern idealist philosophers, he cannot offer insights about anything existing beyond his own mind. Kant considered that the forms of space and time are real within the context of the phenomena, but are ideas with respect to the noumena. These forms are found in the perceiving subject alone. Were he to cease sensing, they also would disappear. With this statement, the question arises of whether his approach allows us to know anything besides subjective appearances. He would reply by introducing his own conception of subjectivity and objectivity. If we take the traditional connotation of the term, meaning within the mind, all experience is subjective for him. Nonetheless, within experience, there is some sense data that follows a predictable pattern. For example, heavy objects always fall to the ground, fire produces heat, and ice is cold. Since these qualities apply regularly to experience and are shared among all people, Kant considers them to be objective. However, we also have sense data in experience that is unexpected and chaotic. For example, in our dreams, we sometimes imagine bizarre, fanciful places where things happen that violate the rules which regulate the world in our waking life. Since these qualities do not fit in with normal experience and are not shared with others, Kant considers them to be subjective. From this distinction, Kant argues there must be a reality existing behind the appearances, which serves to ground the objective properties of experience. In making this claim, he follows the idealist dictum of Descartes and Locke that we can infer things existing outside the mind from inside it. To defend his assertion, one could remark that we could not explain why inner experience has the nature it does without input from the outer world. In other words, why things present themselves precisely the way they do. For instance, something must determine apples to appear as round, shiny, smooth objects, and not with any other combination of attributes. But could they not be produced by a pattern programmed into the mind without input from reality? Kant assumes that his ideas somehow put him in touch with the real world. His general position on this point is similar to that of Aquinas. But a specific difference between the two is that for Aquinas, ideas are the tools by which we reach out into a world beyond our minds and know objects as they are in reality. Conversely, Kant follows the idealism of Locke in maintaining that ideas themselves are the objects of knowledge. And just as it was with Locke, the problem for Kant is that he has no way to know if a reality exists that corresponds to his ideas. Because of this, Kant's assertion that all people share a common objective experience also succumbs to skepticism. Since he only knows his own experience, he cannot confirm that the experiences of others match his own. Indeed, if he wants to remain perfectly consistent with idealism, he cannot even affirm that other minds exist, for they could be nothing but figments of his imagination. For example, consider the following argument. Kant posits that we are conscious of our mental states changing across time as we have different experiences. He then asserts that this sense of change would be unintelligible without reference to something permanent beyond the mind. In offering this reasoning, he relies on the assumption that we perceive change in experience. The problem is that, for him, all we experience directly is a series of sense data. We only devise the concept of a changing permanent being after the mind organizes experience according to the form of time and the category of substance. And because the forms and categories only imply inside the mind, we cannot use them to reason about anything outside it. Our minds conceive objects this way in experience, but this does not mean they must also exist as such outside of it. Kant's argument that the noumena must exist as the cause of the phenomena suffers from a similar issue. For by employing the term appearance, he is hinting that experience is related to reality in some way, even if the resemblance is partial or imperfect. Remember from our analogy that the images on the screen were originally satellite signals which came into the television through the cable from the dish. Once again, the problem is that for him, causality is not a property from experience, but a category within the mind. As a result, Kant's own method forbids him from applying causality to argue for the existence of anything beyond his mind. To return one last time to the example, Kant's attempt to demonstrate that real things are the cause of his experience would be like our imprisoned man speculating about where the images on his television came from. He might stumble by chance upon the correct answer, satellite signals, but without the ability to leave the room and see for himself, he would not know for sure. To conclude, the unifying theme running through the various forms of epistemological idealism discussed in this lecture is a subjective starting point. Idealist philosophers hold that human knowledge begins inside the person, whether in the mind, as with Cartesian rationalists, in experience, as with Lockean empiricists, or in the phenomena, as with the Kantian synthesis of rationalism and empiricism. This is because idealists all share the contention that the immediate object of our knowledge is not reality, but ideas. The problem with this approach is that if the subject starts inside himself, he can never get outside to encounter independently existing objects. In fact, he cannot even be sure that other perceiving subjects exist apart from himself. Hence, idealism taken to its logical conclusion results in solipsism, the most profound type of skepticism, which admits that the subject only knows his own mental states. And one who descends to this level is no longer capable of engaging in any meaningful inquiry about the world, but can only describe and analyze his own ideas. Philosophy is reduced to psychology. However, we can avoid this philosophically suicidal outcome by recognizing that the premise of idealism is flawed. Idealism assumes that the mind is akin to a container which encloses the contents of consciousness. The problem is that we cannot make an equivalence between consciousness and something extended here, for it is not a material thing that is bound by space. Consciousness cannot exist spatially in a mind which is immaterial and non-extended. This is the solution to our problem. If consciousness is not spatially limited, then there is nothing to stop it from extending to external things. And once we recognize that consciousness goes beyond the mind, we can perform a Copernican revolution of our own. Instead of accepting the idealist position that the mind first knows itself, we can follow realists like Aquinas in supposing that it first knows the other. Now, we cannot strictly prove that one position is right and the other wrong, because we are dealing not with deductive reasoning, but first principles. But to produce a productive philosophy, we must assume epistemological realism as an objective starting point.